Savateyev was another person pressurized by the Germans to give false testimony. And he told the Soviet Commission of Inquiry, in the Gestapo, I testified that in spring 1940, Polish war prisoners arrived at the station of Gniezdovo in several trains and proceeded further in trucks, and I did not know where they went. I also added that I repeatedly met those Poles later on the Moscow-Minsk highway, where they were working on repairs in small groups. The officer told me I was mixing things up, that I could not have met the Poles on the highway as they'd been shot by the Bolsheviks, and demanded that I testify to this. I refused. After threatening and cajoling me for a long time, the officer consulted with the interpreter about something in German, and then the interpreter wrote a short protocol and gave it to me to sign. He explained that it was a record of my testimony. I asked the interpreter to let me read the protocol myself, but he interrupted me with abuse, ordering me to sign it immediately and get out. I hesitated a minute. The interpreter seized a rubber club hanging on the wall and made to strike me. After that, I signed the protocol shoved at me. The interpreter told me to get out and go home, and not to talk to anyone or I would be shot. And others gave similar testimony. Evidence was also given as to how the Germans doctored the graves of the victims to try to eliminate evidence that the massacre took place not in the autumn of 1941, but in the spring of 1940, shortly after the Poles first arrived in the area. Alexandra Mikhailovna had worked during the German occupation in the kitchen of a German military unit. In March 1943, she found a Russian war prisoner hiding in her shed. From the conversation with him, I learnt that his name was Nikolai Yegorov, a native of Leningrad. Since the end of 1941, he had been in German camp number 126 for war prisoners in the town of Smolensk. At the beginning of March 1943, he was sent with a column of several hundred war prisoners from the camp in Katyn forest. There, they, including Yegorov, were compelled to dig up graves containing bodies in the uniforms of Polish officers, drag these bodies out of the graves, and take out of their pockets documents, letters, photographs, and other articles. The Germans gave the strictest orders that nothing be left in the pockets on the bodies. 2 war prisoners were shot because they'd searched some of the bodies. After they'd searched some of the bodies, a German officer discovered some papers on those bodies. Articles, documents, and letters extracted from the clothing on the bodies were examined by the German officers, who then compelled the prisoners to put part of the papers back into the pockets on the bodies, while the rest was flung on a heap of articles and documents they'd extracted and later burned. Besides this, the Germans made the prisoners put it in the pockets of the Polish officers some papers which they took from the cases or suitcases, I don't remember exactly, which they had brought along. All the war prisoners lived in Katyn forest in dreadful conditions under the open sky and were extremely strongly guarded. At the beginning of April 1943, all the work planned by the Germans was apparently completed, as for 3 days not one of the war prisoners had to do any work. Suddenly at night, all of them without exception were awakened and led somewhere. The guard was strengthened. Yegorov sensed that something was wrong and began to watch very closely everything that was happening. They marched for 3 or 4 hours in an unknown direction. They stopped in the forest at a pit in a clearing. He saw how a group of war prisoners were separated from the rest and driven towards the pit and then shot. The war prisoners grew agitated, restless, and noisy. Not far from Yegorov, several war prisoners attacked the guards. Other guards ran towards the place. Yegorov took advantage of the confusion and ran away into the dark forest, hearing shouts and firing. After hearing this terrible story, which is engraved on my memory for the rest of my life, she said, I became very sorry for Yegorov and told him to come to my room, get warm, and hide at my place until he'd regained his strength. But Yegorov refused. He said no matter what happened, he was going away that very night and intended to try to get through the front line to the Red Army. In the morning, when I went to make sure whether Yegorov had gone, he was still in the shed. It appeared that in the night he'd attempted to set out, but had only taken about 50 steps. When he felt so weak, he was forced to return. This exhaustion was caused by the long imprisonment at the camp and the starvation of the last days. we decided he should remain at my place several days longer to regain his strength. After feeding Yegorov, I went to work. When I returned home in the evening, my neighbours, Branova, Maria Ivanovna, Kabanovskaya, Yekaterina Viktorovna, told me that in the afternoon, during a search by the German police, the Red Army war prisoner had been found and taken away. Further corroboration was given by an engineer mechanic called Sukachev, who had worked under the Germans as a mechanic in the Smolensk city mill. And he said, "I was working at the mill in the second half of March 1943. There I spoke to a German chauffeur who spoke a little Russian. And since he was carrying flour to Savenki village for the troops and was returning on the next day to Smolensk, I asked him to take me along so that I could buy some fats in the village. My idea was that making the trip in a German truck would get over the risk of being held up at the control stations. The German agreed to take me at a price. On the same day at 10 p.m. we drove on to the Smolensk-Vitebsk highway, just myself and the German driver in the machine. The night was light and only a low mist over the road reduced the visibility. Approximately 22 or 23 kilometers from Smolensk, at a demolished bridge on the highway, there's a rather deep descent at the bypass. We began to go down from the highway when suddenly a truck appeared out of the fog coming towards us. Either because our brakes were out of order or because the driver was inexperienced, we were unable to bring our truck to a halt, and since the passage was quite narrow, we collided with the truck coming towards us. The impact wasn't very violent, as the driver of the other truck swerved to the side, as a result of which the trucks bumped and slid alongside each other. The right wheel of the other truck, however, landed in the ditch and the truck fell over on the slope. Our truck remained upright. The driver and I immediately jumped out of the cabin and ran up to the truck which had fallen down, and we were met by a heavy stench of putrefying flesh coming evidently from the truck. On coming nearer, I saw that the truck was carrying a load covered with a tarpaulin and tied up with ropes. The ropes had snapped with the impact, and part of the load had fallen out on the slope. This was a horrible load, human bodies dressed in military uniforms. As far as I can remember, there were some 6 or 7 men near the truck, 1 German driver, 2 Germans armed with Tommy guns. The rest were Russian war prisoners, as they spoke Russian and were dressed accordingly. The Germans began to abuse my driver and then made some attempts to right the truck. In about 2 minutes' time, 2 more trucks drove up to the place of the accident and pulled up. A group of Germans and Russian war prisoners, about 10 men in all, came up to us from these trucks. By joint efforts, we managed to raise the truck. Taking advantage of an opportune moment, I asked one of the Russian war prisoners in a low voice, "What is it?" And he answered very quietly, "For many nights already we've been carrying bodies to Katyn forest." Before the overturned truck had been raised, a German NCO came up to me and my driver and ordered us to proceed immediately. As no serious damage had been done to our truck, the driver steered it a little to one side and got onto the highway, and we went on. When we were passing the 2 covered trucks which had come up later, I again smelt the horrible stench of dead bodies. So that was his testimony.